continuing series of transition and growth, post-pandemic issues, and of course, growth is always an issue. You could always go to techsd.org to find out additional information about Tech San Diego. We have lots of events kind of around kind of post-pandemic issues, but really gliding into kind of normal business operations, which is always growth. And so this certainly fits into that mode. I'm really excited to have CBRE as our as both our host and speakers. It's going to be very exciting today. You know, I just want to say something about CBRE before we get to our program. You know, the reason, and we've used CBRE all through the pandemic. We did the first. Dennis and Brian and I think some other folks from CBRE. We did our first webinar on kind of pandemic issues, probably 2 weeks after the shutdown. And in YouTube, it's one of our most viewed webinars. And so certainly CBRE has been with us the entire time of the pandemic, kind of guiding our members on their leases, what to do, how to get out of them, how to stay in them, how to get a better deal, but all these kind of hosts of issues around the pandemic. So I want to take the second to really thank CBRE for being there all through the pandemic for the tech community in San Diego. And one of the things I really like about CBRE is they're a great regional firm, but they are a national firm, right? And so they have access to resources that some of the regional guys, quite frankly, really don't have. They work with some of the biggest tech companies in the world, so they're always bringing those best practices back to San Diego. So Dennis and Brian and the rest of the CBRE team, I just want to give you kind of a virtual hand clap. Thank you for being with the tech community during the pandemic and providing that information. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Our sponsor for this event series is our friends over at Ignite Marketing. And again, I think I've told this story. When we said we were doing a growth series on transition and growth, Ignite said, geez, that's kind of what we're into as well. So I invited them to sponsor the series and make sure everyone gets introduced to Ignite Visibility. And in fact, we have Alan Bush, who's their one of the principals over at Ignite Visibility. Alan, why don't I turn it over to you and have you say a few words?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate being here. My name is Alan Bush. I'm the VP of Strategy at Ignite Visibility. We're a premier digital marketing agency, full service. We specialize in SEO, PPC, social media, email, CRO, web development, Amazon, you name it, we probably do it. We've been in business for over 7 years now. I've been with the company for about that length of time. I myself am a 14-year veteran in the space of internet marketing. I am also currently a professor of SEO and web analytics at the University of California, San Diego, as well as an instructor of SEO at the University of San Diego. The courses will be starting soon. If you're interested, let me know. Hit me up on LinkedIn. It's probably the best way to get a hold of me. But I appreciate being here. I can introduce the next person, Kevin, if you'd like me to.
It's all yours, Alan.
Okay. Well, I'd like to hand it off now to Dennis Hurst, Senior Vice President of Tenant Representation, sits on the Tech San Diego's board, is a regular collaborator with the Tech San Diego, bringing to the table his deep knowledge of large San Diego real estate market and provides insights into how that affects the tech ecosystem. So with that, I hand it off to Dennis.
Thank you very much, Alan. Yes, along with my teammate Brian Bozzi and I, we exclusively represent tenants and occupiers of space. We don't do work for landlords. We take a very strategic, analytical, and data-driven approach to real estate decisions. And as exemplified by today's CBRE experts, we give a lot of attention to people, workplace, and the technology required to properly implement those strategies. Without further ado, since Alan said just about everything about me, I'm going to introduce my fabulous partner and a guy that's really the tip of the spear with our technology, Brian Bozzi.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Kevin and Alan. I am really excited for this presentation webinar here today because as the conversation in the real world shifts to the hot topic of flexible workplace, there are many questions that come up, and one of those that are at the forefront is actually technology. So one of the really great benefits of CBRE is the resources that we're able to provide. Just like Kevin said, Dennis mentioned, and even Alan there. And with that, we have some experts that are unparalleled in this community and people that we reach out to and collaborate with day in and day out to ensure that everyone that we work with gets the highest caliber of resources offered to them. So with that, today we're going to be discussing the pitfalls and value for really innovative tools that will help you in creating the correct hybrid workplace. And with the hybrid workplace, there's all different definitions of that when it comes to having reserved office spaces versus open hoteling cubes or free work address areas. And with that, it's now more important than ever that we bridge the physical and digital world via technology. So I'm really excited today to introduce Casey Garcia, who is our Southwest Regional Lead for CBRE's workplace practice. And her team works day in and day out to ensure that companies have the highest caliber of workplace for their employees to help retain and attract talent, as well as Idris Odutoy, who is with our CBRE Network Advisory Services group. And he specifically is really involved in the technology side for companies, where they actually go in and take a look at the technology that you're currently utilizing and then make suggestions and different types of like just consulting on what the best practices that he sees are and makes recommendations on that end. So without further ado, Casey and Idris, you guys can take it from here.
Brian, one just logistics thing before we go. So you should see things where you can ask questions. So put your questions in there. I've asked Brian to help me moderate those questions. We're probably not going to interrupt the speakers unless it's really critical, and Brian or I think we really need to, but we'll probably wait for the questions, but please enter your questions in there. We'll do it. And then Sarah, our marketing person, reminded me, we're actually giving away a set of Padres tickets. So if you're here at the end, she's going to draw a name out for Padres tickets. And so stay towards the very end for that. And with that, I will go off screen and let you guys go to town on this.
Okay, thanks everyone for the introductions. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen so Idris and I can get going on the meat of it. Oh, no, that's the wrong button. Turned off my camera. That's the right button. All right, Idris, help me out. Can everybody see what I'm seeing?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So tools to support the hybrid future. Brian gave the perfect introduction for what we're going to be talking about. I will just give a little bit more of a skeleton overview to the topics that Idris and I are going to weave in and out of. We identified a couple of specific kind of content nodes that we wanted to really dive deep on, because the world of workplace technology is obviously a very large one, and it's not quite as simple as just slapping a web camera in a conference room and calling it a day. We want to be a bit more nuanced in how we're speaking to the approaches that we're recommending in these scenarios. So number one, we're going to kick it off. We're going to talk about the concept of mixed presence collaboration, which just by way of quick definition means, when you've got some people who are on site and some people who are virtual. This is going to be unavoidable in the future hybrid world, as we have some people who are going to continue to work virtually and others who will begin to come back on site. The second topic that we want to talk about is asynchronous collaboration. And this may be an unfamiliar term to you, but what should be familiar by now are the different softwares such as Teams and Slack and other kinds of project management type softwares. There's been a huge boom in the providers in this world. And so what does it look like when you can't all be working side to side at the same time? What are our tips and tools for that? Number three, we're going to be talking about virtual reality and augmented reality and potentially some of the practical applications there. And then lastly, we're going to cover what many are calling smart building features. So that's anything from sensors to touchless technology to the Internet of Things, lots of really great buzzwords to talk about there and how that's being implemented across a commercial or an office facility at large. And then of course, as always, we're going to leave some time for Q&A at the end. So please save them for then or push them forward into the chat box as we go, and we'll look forward to addressing those. Okay, but let's get started. I want to talk about mixed presence collaboration first, because this is probably the biggest hurdle to solve for And practically speaking, you know, we want to talk about, as Brian introduced in the intro, bridging that physical and digital environment. There's kind of a consistency of experience when we're either all on site and all or all working virtually. But as soon as that starts to crack, as soon as we start to have both, we're going to need to be a little bit more thoughtful about it. So Idris, I want to pass the microphone to you to speak first on this topic and just help us understand, you know, how are your clients upgrading their conference room technology in order to enhance these kinds of meetings that have both virtual and in-person participants?
That's a great question. You know, I really believe we're at an inflection point because of not just the pandemic, but just the adoption of technology. And as we're all doing today, and we've done for the last 18 months or so, it's really helped bridge the gap where we can still be productive despite not being face-to-face. And so a lot of companies now, we're coming on the other side of this, you know, they're concerned about security, right? They're concerned about the adoption of such technology. The kind of the presence disparity between always being in person and now we have this hybrid approach. So what we're finding is there's so many options in the marketplace, right? From GoToMeeting we're on now to Zoom to WebEx to Teams, all these different type solutions, but the conference room now is becoming a focal point. And so how some customers are trying to use the technology is by engaging in using smart cameras or AI cameras that allow them to kind of see their position in a room and then display it on the virtual screen, right? So that now you don't just see people sitting around a table. It looks like what we're doing right now. And so that kind of helps with that interaction and the collaboration. One of the challenges though becomes the increase or the need of bandwidth, right? So before, we used to just go into a conference room and have a discussion. Well, now that we're all virtual, now you need more bandwidth. So internet capacity is growing. I think since we've been in the pandemic, it's increased by X percentage from probably about 84 megs to now 95 megs on average. And so that's continuing to be a topic of discussion. And then one of the other issues is, you know, the excess of tools. Now you have disparate tools being used within the same organization. Some groups love Zoom, some groups love Teams, some love WebEx, but now there's a duplicity of tools and it's hard to now get the value and get the ROI behind it. So those are some things that I think are challenging for customers, but you know, we're finding that people are needing a trusted advisor, someone they can kind of go to that say, here's my requirements, here's what I use today. Who are then the best providers for me to align with? And that's kind of the approach that our group takes within CBRE. Leverage our buying power, leverage our kind of knowledge of the industry, and then bring those kind of market leaders to align with a client's requirements.
Excellent. Thanks for those comments, Idris. The only thing that I'll overlay on top of everything that Idris just said are a couple of practical considerations that you can implement regardless of what system or software you choose to invest in. The first is thinking about kind of the design features of what comprises a well-provisioned virtual conference room versus a not so well provisioned virtual conference room. And the devil really is in the details here. So number one, and this is somewhat illustrated even by the stock photography we have on this slide, is you'll want to consider the monitor height and the distance of the monitor from the table in order to kind of start to replicate that feeling of the person on video being just another seat at the table. Making sure that it's not too high, not too far away, they're not off in some dark corner. And kind of diminishing the experience that they're having as part of the conversation. The second, and this is actually a what not to do as shown by this stock photography, is you actually want to consider having at least 2 monitors, I think, in video conference enabled rooms. And that's because although having 1 monitor, as it's kind of shown in the stock photography, it works well if you're just talking. As soon as you start to share screens, as soon as you start to share content, what typically happens with most of the software providers for video conferencing is that window with the talking head, that minimizes and it goes off to a corner or potentially is removed altogether. And so if you want to maintain the engagement and the ability to have eye contact and read body language, you'll probably want one dedicated monitor for video and another dedicated for content. Next, you want to think about table shape and overall orientation. Semicircles or guitar pick shaped conference tables are really ideal for maximizing that camera view and making sure that everybody is visible across the plane of where the camera can point towards and make the virtual participants feel like they're sitting with the group. And then lastly, I'll mention that larger rooms, these are going to require just some specialty considerations. They need a particular setup for AV, things like distributed microphones, speakers, monitors, and even cameras multiplied throughout the room in order to ensure that everything is covered and that content is handled. So make sure that you're carving out a special strategy for that. And then lastly, you know, it's not always just about the tech. You know, the theme of this conversation today is technology and tools, but I will say probably multiple times on this call, technology is only as good as the people who are using it. So a few extra tips that I have for mitigating the disadvantages of remote work, at least as much as possible, is number one, just consider that the default be if one person has to join virtually to any meeting, maybe make it an entirely remote meeting so that there's a consistent experience. If you can avoid the mixed presence meeting, by all means do so. If you find yourself successful at implementing 100% virtual meetings, this actually is preferable, generally speaking, to having a hybrid. But you know, when a mixed presence meeting is unavoidable, a couple things. The first challenge generally that we have to solve is whiteboarding. So you want to probably migrate to a virtual whiteboarding environment rather than regular analog, just because you want virtual participants to be able to join in and actually participate in the whiteboarding. They want to be able to grab the virtual marker, so to say. It also helps in just documenting the results of the meeting, and this is true whether you have virtual participants or not. I think we've all had the experience of trying to take a shaky cell phone camera picture of what we drew up on the board, or we've seen somebody write, you know, do not erase in the corner of a whiteboard in a conference room, and that just causes more difficulties and friction in managing your spaces as well. Then you could also kind of come up with some different MacGyver solutions if you do prefer the kind of old school regular version of whiteboarding. So you could consider just pointing a camera directly at that space. You'll of course want to be mindful of what markers you're using. It sounds so silly, but if you've ever tried to read what somebody's writing on a whiteboard through a camera when they're using a weak green colored marker or something like that, it makes you feel like you're completely losing your eyesight. Another creative idea, and this is inspired by an animation client of mine, what they've actually done is they've outfitted a top-down view from a camera. They just outfitted a camera in the ceiling, and this allowed the view to be of the conference table so that horizontal sketching, which obviously in creative industries feels more natural than trying to do so vertically on a whiteboard, was visible to all the different participants. And then I'll say, you know, the second challenge, you know, as we're thinking about mixed presence meetings from a people perspective, is all about just behaviors and etiquette. So number one, you'll always want to encourage participants when they're in person or not, you know, to vary up how and who they're addressing, you know, making sure that you're making eye contact and talking directly to people who are joining virtually. Invite them to speak or respond, and ensure that there are obvious places for them to contribute. It's really difficult to find a moment when you're virtual to jump in and provide a comment. And so if those in the room are not aware of that and accommodating to that, you can quickly find them feeling like, what was the point of me joining this meeting in the first place? There are also kind of small details around the experience. For example, if you're hosting some kind of a board meeting or something like that, and the meeting is typically catered, you might want to consider sending virtual participants something similar, whether that's a lunch that gets sent through some kind of a delivery service or coffee or a gift. Again, it's all about kind of providing a consistency of experience and not penalizing people who may have to work virtually, whether that's because of the nature of their role or the way that we've structured our hybrid approach. And then lastly, and I'm personally an evangelical for this particular point, given how big of a difference it makes in my day, but consider transition time, building that into your agenda. both for things like just general small talk at kind of the start and end of the meeting, because that's a really valuable part of collaboration in most organizations, but also thinking about the buffer in between meetings. I'm a big fan of non-traditional meeting durations, things like 15-minute meetings or 45-minute meetings instead of the typical 30 and 60, because when you have those neat kind of 30 and 60-minute blocks, what typically happens is you'll pack in your schedule, right? You'll have that dreaded back-to-back day, and that's draining for everyone, not to mention it doesn't really leave you the time to go grab water or coffee or use the restroom, right? Really human needs, and it can make a big difference in just the sustainability of how we're all able to operate in a hybrid mode. So that's mixed presence collaboration. I'm going to take us into the next topic, which is asynchronous collaboration. And just as a reminder of what this means, it's kind of just explaining that, look, if we're going to be working in a hybrid way, we're not always going to have the luxury of working side by side, right? As this picture illustrates, when we're all in the office, it can be just as simple as turning around in your chair or walking past someone in the hallway to solve some of those kind of just ad hoc challenges that come up as you're working. Asynchronous is kind of a virtual solution to that, of saying, well, you know, we may not all be working on the same thing at the same time, but how are we communicating to each other across different time zones or across different geographies in order to keep everybody on the same page? So thinking about asynchronous collaboration, I'm going to turn it back to Idris and again ask you to help articulate some of the specific tools for asynchronous collaboration that you've seen your clients adopting.
Yeah, that's a good question. As you mentioned, you know, trying to get people across perhaps different locations, time zones, countries to now collaborate together. This technology is allowing us to do that somewhat seamlessly, right? So you have the ability to use technologies like Slack or Teams or, you know, other solutions like that. As you mentioned, virtual whiteboards when you're trying to annotate and provide content. All these kinds of tools enable organizations to do that. And one of the things that's helpful with that is you may find that you can get talent, you know, from an employment standpoint, from your employees from different parts of the country that perhaps is more cost effective, or there's a niche kind of solution set in a certain part of the country, but now you can attract that talent because you're able to do that in a virtual or hybrid fashion. So, and then having the ability to work at your own pace, right? So some employees, hey, they may fire at all cylinders at 9 o'clock in the morning, whereas others, they really get going, their minds get going at 2, and they can crank through information better later in the day. Well, now you have the ability to use these types of tools instead of sending emails back and forth, and God forbid your IT manager tells you you have a cap on your inbox and you have to get rid of things. These kinds of tools, SharePoint, things like that through Teams allows you to box, allows you to store information and then get to it within the time frame that's best for you. So those are some of the things that we see. I think some of the things that people worry about and just trying to figure out is, to your point here, how do you negatively impact relationships and interactions when you're not together, right? Or how do I make sure I can monitor productivity when people aren't in the office? And there are tools that help us to kind of account for that. Or what if people don't adopt the technology? That's always a challenge. So how do you maybe wrap in adoption services, training, and things of those nature to help people better adopt the technology, that the solution or the strategy of the team or the organization? And then again, how do you secure it? Because security keeps coming up, right? And you know, security experts are very expensive, and so those are some of the challenges organizations are finding. Is how do I get the assistance from a cybersecurity perspective to protect some of that data? And then there's partners that obviously do that. So some of the things that we're seeing are people are not necessarily replacing collaboration with in-person, it's just augmenting, right? So now that we're getting back to the office, they're now having the ability to maybe augment things where people aren't on the same schedules to be in the office, or maybe there's health and safety protocols that only allow a certain capacity. So now you have to rotate people. Well, these solutions allow you to still be productive while adhering to those protocols. I've personally seen and worked with a client, a university client, that wanted to do a hybrid classroom. So their thought was, okay, we're coming back out of the pandemic. We've got people in classroom. we've got a professor, but we also have people in the dorm or at home. Now, how do we all be in the same session, this classroom session together? So there's hybrid, as we mentioned, whiteboards that are virtual that now allow, with the professors writing on the board, everyone can see in class on remotely. All those kinds of services and obviously exist across different kind of platforms. But then there's managed security service providers, they call them MSSPs, that now help. How do I secure this data that's maybe sitting in some cloud-based applications to make sure? Because some of the misnomer is that when it's in the cloud, it's secure. Well, I think many of us have found that that's not necessarily the case, that there still needs to be some governance and oversight, even when applications and data live in the cloud.
Yeah, that's a whole can of worms that I'll save for the Q&A.
A whole other session.
Question on that one. and a scary one. But on a lighter note, again, I'll just kind of come in and layer on top of that the best practices from a people perspective when you're using these asynchronous tools. And there's a couple of things that seem obvious, but are worth articulating and being intentional about, because assumption is the enemy of success in here. And what we're finding as we implement these new tools and these new methodologies across most of my clients is that soft skills do vary across your management levels and rank and file employees. And so trainings on even what sound like the most simple and rudimentary of behaviors makes a marked difference in how tenable these solutions are. So first thing that I'll recommend is, number one, clarifying the roles and responsibilities across a project team or across a department. There's nothing worse than thinking that someone is responsible for something and spending a whole week or more assuming that things are being made progress on, and then come to find out in the meeting with a client, later on that nothing was actually done. So, in order to get the most out of these tools, a lot of them have assignment features actually for who might be responsible for a task, who might be responsible for oversight on that task, and you can make the best use of those features with good communication skills and an understanding of why each person is responsible for different things and deadlines and all those kinds of things. Next is around communication expectations in general. As soon as you start to implement more of these tools, as Idris is saying, there's kind of just there's a lot of different preferences, right? Well, are we using Teams, or are we using email, or am I calling you, right? And personal kind of modes of work play in just as much as what an organization is investing in, because some people will check their email more frequently or are traveling more often, and so their cell phone is the best way to get a handle of them. So communicating what those modes of communication are and making sure that it's well established across the team so that there's kind of a uniformity of where your data is stored and where edits are being made is going to be critical. Otherwise, all of these tools will become more of a burden as you seek to reconcile them on an ongoing basis. There's also simple things about communication that you always want to make sure that you're establishing with your groups or your direct reports. It's thinking about what's the timing of communication expected when you're not side by side. There can be some anxiety from managers of saying, well, wait, I need to know what my employees are doing every minute of every day. But their employees, may not be thinking the same way. They may be thinking, well, of course I'm working. I'll send a status update at the end of the day or at the end of the week, and whatever is needed for the tenure of that employee or the training point of them is fine, as long as everybody's just on the same page about it. And then again, thinking about personal preferences of, am I an early bird or a night owl? What time zones are people working in? What are the expectations for whether we should be respectful of quiet times and moments for heads down collaboration? And an easy way also of kind of managing these different kinds of expectations around communication is just being more transparent with your schedule. If you use any of the kind of typical calendar programs, Microsoft Outlook or Google Calendar, there are ways of sharing your availability across your team. And you can do that in a limited or a full capacity, but allowing someone to kind of peek in and see what your day looks like, know when you're blocked, can really help them strategically know when to ping you with a question, especially if something is urgent and they can kind of understand contextually what's kind of pulling your attention in different locations. And then lastly, I'll mention, asynchronous collaboration and the tools that are there for us. It's not just about productivity. Productivity obviously is very important, but it can also really help with culture and just moments for fun and humanness. Some of the creative things that I've seen my clients implement is just interesting channel structures for different topics, like a channel for inspirational posts. If you see something really cool and interesting while you're reading the Wall Street Journal or something like that, you can post and have conversations that just keep people really engaged in the industry. You can also post channels that are meant for recognition of employees. So you could say, hey, so-and-so did a really fantastic job on this presentation to the client. There was a really great result. Let's everybody celebrate that for a moment. Or you could also create some different channels around different hobbies and ways to just get to know each other on a more personal level, besides just talking about business. So some of the cool channels I've seen with my clients are channels dedicated to photography or cooking or meditation, and allows people to just bring a little bit more of an element of work-life balance into what we're doing, and again, bridge that gap as we're all working in isolation of one another and make us feel a little bit more close and well connected. So let's talk now about VR and AR, probably one of the most talked about topics, but I think one of the ones that causes the most confusion as well, because here's the rub, right? VR and AR, it sounds very futuristic, but what are the practical applications? And so Idris, I'd love if you could give a few examples of how you've really seen workplaces use VR or AR to implement across a work process or an experience that you find really meaningful.
Yeah, this is an interesting topic, as you mentioned. There could be a lot of fluff to this technology in terms of the value that it brings. I'm a techie. I like Star Wars, Star Trek, Marvel, and you have these holographic, images, and so people think, well, okay, are holograms of ourselves interacting? Is that going to be the new norm, right? If anybody saw the interview between Oprah and Barack Obama, the former president, and they were in a room that looked like Oprah's, basically her living room, but they were behind this green screen right here, and they were able to kind of simulate them talking to each other, facing, but they were really looking at the camera. So people started thinking, well, is that where things are going? And obviously that technology exists, but I think it's going to be determined on the use case. And what I mean by that is I think we're starting to see virtual tours, whether it be in the commercial real estate space, whether it be data centers or a customer experience. And I give an example. We had a technology partner that they wanted to basically help a customer see what would the experience be like if I flew to Chicago and I looked at, it was like a lab basically of all this kind of technology. Is that worth me getting on a plane to do that? And so now you have these VR goggles. You can actually visualize the room. You can see everything they want to show you in person, and basically entices you to say, okay, this might be worth my investment to get on a plane and go. So I think we're seeing things like that when you're trying to create an experience that would be in person, but you're trying to entice the person to make that trip. The VR is definitely a way to do that. Or simulators. When you're trying to simulate, whether it be trainings and things of that nature, where you're trying to simulate things. I think the gaming communities have done a great job using the VR for things of that nature. So I think depending on the customer and the use case, it could be applicable. I just don't know yet if it'll be widespread technology that any organization can truly benefit from.
Yeah. It's still very much in its infancy, but I do have a few stats that I wanted to share with the group to consider, is that there have been some large manufacturing companies, especially and tech companies as well, that have been experimenting with AR and VR and have been conducting some just forays into understanding what the real return on investment is here. So in the first one I'll cite is a study that was conducted by Boeing recently that showed how their implementation of AR improved their productivity in wiring their harness assembly by 25%. So very measurable impact there. Similarly, GE Healthcare They used AR to help warehouse workers receive new pick list orders rather than using a standard process that relied on a paper list and item searches at a workstation. And their workers were able to complete these tasks 46% faster using AR. And just generally, I could list several more of these. There's been a handful of them across different industries, but on average, productivity improvements can be somewhere in the range of 30%. Especially when you're looking at warehouse roles, lab-based roles, highly technical and specialized roles, where it makes sense that having something that's a little bit more tactile and illustrative enriches the experience and brings people up a learning curve faster. And Idris, also, you mentioned the training application for that as well. I think there's just generally a greater awareness of neurodiversity and different learning styles that are present across the workforce. And so having something like VR and AR at our disposal to supplement what can be often, very dry user manuals, or at best very lengthy, kinds of documented training presentations and video, we'll just reach whole new audiences, diversify our ability to, transfer knowledge across generations. And, as we think about the workforce in general, we've got a large portion of the baby boomer generation looking to retire across the next several years. And I believe the latest stats are that millennials in the next 2 or so years will comprise somewhere around 75% of the workforce. And Gen Z is hot on their heels, and their expectations for what a high-tech workplace looks like are also increasing. So the value here is not just, again, around productivity, it's also around people and perception, and demonstrating a willingness to invest in innovative approaches that will help your employees reach new heights of their career and be as effective as possible. And some recent studies have shown actually that about 44% of millennials believe that their current workplace isn't smart enough. And of course, these frustrations with technology have only become sharper through the pandemic. And so in order to be competitive from a talent attraction and retention point of view, playing around with VR and AR and thinking about how you can kind of expand the way that you're provisioning your workplace beyond just a typical laptop is going to help keep you competitive. All right, last topic. Just want to talk about smart building features, since we are talking about becoming smarter. So I want to talk about just it more broadly, inside and outside the workplace. We could talk about it in lobbies. We could talk about it, in the infrastructure. But Idris, what new building technology are you seeing your clients implementing, and how are they really using that data that's collected? Because now that we've got the Internet of Things, there seems to be so much at our fingertips. What are people doing with this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fast-growing and trendy technology around, whether it be sensors, as you can see there, to kind of somewhat track when people are in and out of buildings, especially now with contact tracing, things of those natures from a health and safety protocol. But people, again, worried about security, right? Data, the privacy of people's data, the cost of such solutions. Some of the challenges that you're trying to figure out, well, how do I manage the flow of traffic, right? What we said earlier, you may have a health and safety protocol that says 50% of people of the capacity should be in a space. Well, how do I monitor that? How do I actually tangibly alert myself if I've reached 55% or 60%? So, there are smart cameras that allow heat mapping in spaces. The retail space is using this a lot, or even concerts when you're trying to maybe open up another lane because the traffic isn't flowing. You're able to keep the 6 feet distancing, but it's causing some, clogged up ways. So now an alert tells me, okay, I need to open another lane, or a second or third lane. So those types of technologies with smart cameras are definitely coming into play. And then others are, sensors, or the ability to log in and out of a phone at a desk, right? So maybe Casey comes in today, Idris comes in tomorrow. Well, how do I know which desk they used, right? So now I can log into a phone, or there's a sensor there, I can swipe my badge. So now I was there from this time to that time, right? So those are types of things that are helping customers try to figure out that piece. And then contact contactless thermometer readers. You know, we're coming out of the pandemic, but obviously, depending on who you listen to, how far out, we don't know with these variants and other things that are going on. So is there still going to be a need to manage, hey, what is your temperature when you enter a building? So we make sure, so those technologies exist. And then I think this is one of the unique things I just learned recently, that, see, some of these smart cameras can associate with how many people are on a, let's just say you have 3 or 4 floors in a building, and one floor is not being utilized at all. Well, this camera can tell you, hey, there's no one on this floor, so the next person that comes in, let's send them to the second floor because that's only 30% utilized. Or let's lower or increase the temperature to save cost on your utility bill because there's no one on the 4th floor. So there's certain things where now you can start to see an ROI or a specific use case that benefits the organization. I had another one where, and this is here, I'm in the DC market, in the DC area, DC Public Works, where they have dump trucks, the people, contractors that own dump trucks that bring and haul in trash to and forth the dump. Well, they didn't previously, these cameras didn't have a way to validate if you came the days you said you dumped trash. So now these cameras can read the license plate, and then they can, on the back end, the analytics can track it to who owns the dump truck to now validate that you were here Tuesday and Wednesday. So I only pay you for Tuesday and Wednesday, and not Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, because you try to get a little bit more money than you were actually owed. So that kind of technology, being able to take a measure of the dump truck's heat, because unbeknownst to me, there's gas in there, and if it gets too hot, it can get combustible, it can blow up. So making sure that that's regulated. So it's all these different types of technology and tools that can help organizations, depending on the industry, on how they can utilize this in a way that benefits the bottom line, and it's not just flashy technology.
Yeah, flashy technology is always the risk, and so along that line, where I wanted to end this conversation was around one specific technology that I get asked about a lot, which is desk reservation systems. Maybe not what first comes to mind when you think flashy, but in some cases, maybe outside the scope of useful technology that I would recommend. And I wanted to articulate why and where this type of technology makes sense and what the pros and cons are. So really the reason why we're talking about desk reservation systems so often is because there's been a surge in popularity for desk sharing occupancy strategies. If you've heard of hot desking, activity-based work, free address, it goes by a million different names. But really at its core, what it means is it means you've got fewer desks than people, and it's kind of a pool of desks, and whoever comes in gets to use it. And really, you know, the question of should we implement a reservation system, this comes up a lot because it stems from the anxiety from my clients around, well, are there going to be enough seats? Because now we've taken away some, you know, what if we've got an unusually busy day and everybody shows up, right? Do we have to turn them away at the door? And so the instinct there is, well, I need to monitor this closely and control it from a technological standpoint, which is an understandable instinct, but one that I would recommend examining critically. And so there are 3 points that I want to make around desk reservation systems if you're considering implementing these in your own workplace. Point number 1 is really even pre-implementation of the system is making sure that you have the right number of desks to begin with, right? Because the system itself is not going to solve for that if you don't design your workplace appropriately. And so I'll just caution people about the allure of false math when thinking about how many desks they can remove, because 50% work from home does not equal 15% space or seat consolidation. If it was so easy, then there would not be any problems and I would probably very quickly be out of business. But typically it works out a little bit differently because you do have peaks and valleys of when people come in, unless you control your occupancy in the sense that you have some kind of a shift schedule, or you say, okay, Bob, Molly, and Sue, you know, they come in Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Brad and Tina, they come in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, right? In that case, you can have a much more predictable, even occupancy across the week. But for most of my clients, choice is kind of the preference, especially because the whole point is around flexibility, in which case you'll probably see Tuesdays and Wednesdays be the most popular on-site days, right? And so those are going to be your peaks. And then you're going to see Thursdays, Fridays, maybe Mondays be your valleys, as those are days that people typically prefer to work from home, or they take a long weekend, or whatever else it is. And so you've got to meet that strategically. Think about the ecosystem of your office and make sure that you've provisioned the right amount of space and you don't get too greedy or fall too much in love with the space savings that workplace flexibility affords you. Now, number two, and this is more about people than about technology, but when you're using a desk reservation system, just like when you're using a conference room reservation system, there's always the possibility of hoarding behaviors, right? And what I mean by that is that employees might be tempted to circumvent the spirit of the desk sharing program and just say, well, you know what, I'm going to reserve my favorite desk every day, whether I plan to come in or not, because I want to be able to know for sure that I have that. And they'll put up some kind of a recurring reservation, right? And you see this with conference rooms too. And this is a management problem, because what that can do is, if that person actually isn't using that desk, especially, it just creates this false scarcity of space, and it could potentially prevent people from coming in. If that seat's not available, it starts to become a more widespread problem. And then certainly I've seen cases as well where with this technology implement, someone puts that recurring reservation on, maybe they leave the company, and that reservation doesn't disappear. And so suddenly you've got all these ghost reservations, right? So you have to consider the implications of when you implement a technology, you also have to implement a process and a procedure for how to use it, how to sanitize it regularly, how to ensure that it's working as possible, and what to do if you need to course correct some of these bad behaviors, I'll say, and how the technology is supposed to be used. And the last point that I'll make is that, whether or not you need a desk reservation system also in many ways is dictated by the size and scale of your facility or your portfolio. And to illustrate this point, I always encourage people to think about parking garages, right? Because I think we're all familiar with the sensor technology that's available for parking garages. You see the red light, green light, or you'll see the little board that says, oh, there's X number of spaces available on this floor. It's really convenient. It's really helpful, because what you don't want is you don't want to be driving around endlessly in circles looking for that one scarce parking spot, right? Same thing for offices, right? If you have a large campus or a multi-floor high-rise, it does make more sense to implement a desk reservation system, because similarly, you don't want that uncertainty of where am I, or where is my team going to be able to sit? Are we going to have to go up, down, and around on multiple stairs, escalators, and elevators to figure out where we need to sit? That's obviously inconvenient, it's a waste of time, and it influences productivity in a negative way. However, if you have the kind of office where you're really only on a couple of floors, it's much easier to manage your occupancy by a system of neighborhoods, and saying, okay, well, the finance team, you're going to be assigned to this corner of the office. It doesn't mean that Casey and Idris have an assigned desk, but it means that Casey and Idris, as part of this team, know more or less where to go, and kind of within that area, you're kind of selecting what's available. And from there, if that neighborhood happens to be experiencing a particularly high volume day, it's pretty easy to conduct some overflow into the next nearest neighborhood. The burden on the employee to find a seat in those smaller ecosystems of offices is not quite as great as if you're in a much larger type of facility. So those are our tips and tricks. We'll end kind of the formal part of the presentation now and open it up to Q&A. And actually, I think the intention was while we go through the Q&A, I'll just leave us on this contact page. We've included all of our email addresses and phone numbers, from me and Idris as the speakers to Dennis and Brian as our hosts. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions or comments after this presentation. But Brian, back to you for the questions that have come in. What do you have for us?
Yeah, well, thank you, Idris and Casey. That was amazing, very, very informative. And just so everyone does know, that was a very more high-level discussion of these topics. And to get into the nuances and to get the details and specific questions answered, we are more than willing to answer any questions that you have or specifics that you have on any of the topics that were discussed today. So if you would like to reach out to us, our contact information is there for you, and we will be very responsive. So we do have some questions. So the first one is actually going to be directed towards Idris. And the question is, what are the common pitfalls you see clients make when evaluating technology?
Yeah, a lot of it is we have a tendency, and this is any of us, is to look at the lowest cost option, right? So, hey, how do I get the best product for the cheapest price? And we all know the analogy of saying you get what you pay for. So there are times where the lowest cost option may be the best option, but a lot of times the value you get is not really what you end up expecting. So I always am an advocate of, let's just look at the whole market. Let's look at the top, let's look at the bottom, let's look at the middle, and let's make sure we align it to your requirements and the governance around those requirements. And then let us negotiate for you to get you the best price possible, as opposed to starting from the bottom up. So I think that's somewhat of the challenges within IT. And another thing I think that challenges IT organizations within companies is that they're scarce as far as resources. So trying to be able to keep the lights on, but also do all this research to figure out what's out there. A lot of times there's only so much time in a day, and you're not able to do a thorough investigation of what's available.
Thank you. Well said. Casey, the next one's actually directed towards you. So there's a lot of conversation about culture and employee engagement suffering when working remote. Is this something that technology can solve for?
This is a hotly debated issue because some are of the opinion that there's not really a problem. They find it incredibly fluid and easy for them to stay connected. They're digital natives, right? They're bopping around and they have no problem with replicating all of their normal conversations and interactives in a virtual sphere. And there are others that feel completely shut out by technology and think this is cold, this is inhuman, you know, this doesn't really get me where I need to go. And then the lessons are compounding the longer that coronavirus goes on, because there's a whole class, I'd say, of people who are new hires at a company. You know, they've transitioned to a different role or a different company during the pandemic, and in many cases will have never even met in-person teams that they've had to be working closely with over the next couple of months. So, you know, the way that I always phrase it is this, is that technology helps, but it's likely not a silver bullet. And it certainly isn't going to be a silver bullet for everyone, because as I mentioned before, the diversity of the workforce is always going to be such that, you know, there's no one size fits all. The other thing that I'll say, though, and this is an interesting case study from one of my recent clients, is that, you know, I think there needs to be a recognition of, you know, what is valuable about working from home or working remotely versus what is valuable about working on site, and just working to preserve, you know, the strengths and weaknesses of both of those, and just accepting that neither is going to be probably 100% for anyone or for everyone. And what I mean by that is this, you know, there's one of my tech clients that decided that they were going to be piloting one of the newer softwares out there that's meant to provide a virtual workplace for their remote workers. And what it literally does, and I won't share names because we don't endorse any products on this in this sphere, but what it basically does is it's got kind of a virtual map, kind of like in a video game, of what a typical office would look like, you know, open cubes and hallways and conference rooms and offices, what have you. And you can move through the map using your arrow keys or mouse or something like that. And you've got like a little avatar on the screen, which is basically your video camera. And it enables your audio. It'll turn on your microphone if you happen to be within a certain distance of someone. So Brian, if I'm walking next to you, you know, just past you in a virtual hallway, right, it turns on our microphones and we're able to say hey to each other, right? And maybe I ask you a question, or maybe I say, hey, let's pop into a conference room. I actually wanted to talk to you about something. And you just kind of navigate through the office in a virtual way, just like you would in an office. It sounds cool. I mean, I was starstruck by it. I really wanted to try it out. It's one of those kind of flashy new technologies that went through. that's coming out recently. But here's the interesting piece about their pilot at this stage, because at this point, you know, Australia has been open for a couple of months now. They implemented out there in Asia Pac, and you know, the results were a little bit lukewarm. They were like, yeah, it's fine, it's interesting, it's exciting, and we really enjoyed the experimentation of it all. But at the end of the day, what they found is that it actually erodes some of the benefits of working from home. When they're working from home, they don't want to be distracted or interrupted by people coming to talk to them. The benefit of working from home is exactly that disconnection. So it's both a pro and a con when you're working from home, that culture and communication might be just a little bit more stifled. And so for that reason, you know, that kind of then motivates them to come back into the office. So they said, we want to keep remote, and we want to keep on-site. And it's fine that neither is a complete imitation of the other. We want to lean into it. And so, you know, in this particular case, this client is choosing to sunset their investment in this product. But the other thing that I'll say is that journey was incredibly invaluable, because you can tell somebody that at the beginning of the process, but seeing is believing, or living is believing, right? And there's a change management aspect to this where people need to really kind of go through it to assuage their anxieties.
And I think you hit a keyword there too, where you said culture. Culture is such a big component for a company. And that is one of the big issues that we are hearing from our clients as well, is how they can create this culture virtually and have new employees feel just as valued and connected to the company as more veteran employees. So well said. Kevin, it sounds like you may have a question. Do you have any questions that you want to ask right now? You might want to pull your microphone down, sorry. Kevin, you might be muted.
Kevin's having a great conversation.
Okay, well, Kevin, we can't hear you right now, so I'm just going to ask Casey and Idris another question. No.
So really quickly, we did get a question that came in through our questions section. Emily asks, we are looking to get a desk reservation system at our office. Do you have any recommended platforms?
More than I could list here. So actually, Emily, what I would recommend is, if you want to send me a direct email, I actually do have an overview page. It's just a quick one pager. It compares the features of some of the biggest players in the market. There's probably 50 at this point, but I think we've got the top 10 or 15 listed in there, and it's a good place to start.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there we go.
Sorry about that. I was going to ask the question that Sarah just answered. The other question I have is about meeting rooms. And so, you know, you're in the middle of a lease and you may not have a lot of funds for TI improvements, tenant. I mean, what can you do to existing meeting rooms? I mean, is upgrading those with new AV? What would you recommend to upgrade existing meeting rooms with?
There's a lot of options, right? So to Casey's point, we won't endorse any one, but there are technologies where you can add some AI cameras. If you have monitors in those rooms already, if you need to add those, you can. Some of that's going to depend on if they have health and safety protocols they want listed outside the room, or if they want, you know, an iPad of some sort, a screen that says, hey, there's 5 people in this room, there's no more space because of these protocols. So there are definitely ways to solve for that, but it is a more in-depth conversation, but there are definitely ways for it.
I just want to make sure those people weren't discouraged by saying, geez, we have our existing rooms and, you know, it sounds like they're not going to work with what we're doing. That they can be retrofitted, and there are multiple options for them to enhance existing conference rooms, correct?
Yes, sir.
That's exactly right. I will say though, Kevin, you know, one of the things that I think is most impactful is often sometimes the most expensive. If the acoustic properties of your conference rooms are not up to par, that's a big problem, right? Because being able to hear somebody through the warbling and translation of, you know, being on a phone or speaking through a monitor speaker, that's difficult. And then if there's lots of those kinds of meetings going on at the same time, it's probably the #1 reported frustration with conference room build outs as they exist today. And it's one that I think needs a lot more attention going forward as we introduce new technologies.
Yeah, and to Casey's point, a lot of times I advocate to work in concert with that AV partner that the organization may already have, because the acoustics is one of the main things that has to be solved for, whether you have windows in the room, you don't have windows, what's the color of the room, because ironically, the color actually matters. It's how the sound bounces off the walls. So all these different things we can definitely speak to.
I didn't know that. Wow. What's the
Yeah,
value?
I think
that's a fun
interesting,
fact.
Casey, you guys hit on something. You talk about trusted people, right? And so, one of the things I'm going to advise people on this call is start developing relationships with those contacts on the bottoms, right? Especially locally here, Dennis and Brian, right? Irregardless of whether you lease us up next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, it doesn't matter. Start developing these relationships, and they have those trusted connections, right? You don't have to get on a Google and Google AV meeting consultants, right? That's not going to be the way to go. And so start developing these relationships so you can really start building those trusted advisors up would be part of my advice as well.
Yeah, and that is a great point because, starting well before any type of lease expiration or anything that's a really triggering moment is what gets us to be a true value to any company when it comes to our resources. The breadth of resources that we have at CBRE is unparalleled. I don't just say that because I'm here at CBRE. Even other firms would admit that to us. So it's not something that you can take lightly. And because of that, every one of these services are offered to anyone that we talk to, whether we're doing an active transaction with them or we're just in communication with you and trying to assist you to be the best company that you can be. And with that, let's go to one more question before we end this. And I think this is a really important question because it's something I think we're all talking about right now. And so there's an overwhelming amount of workplace technology out there. What are some recommended evaluation criteria for determining which technology to invest in?
Yeah, I think trying to understand what do you have today. It's kind of a baseline, right? And then when we can baseline that, then we'll figure out, well, what are you trying to accomplish, right? So, and then between that, now what technology do I need to invest in to kind of help me meet that strategy? I think a lot of times what we found, even with the pandemic, is people rushed to figure out something because they had no choice. And now a lot of people are now backtracking to figure out, okay, does this meet governance? Does this have all the security wrapped around it that I need? And I think that's where we're starting to see a lot of these breaches happen because there's things that have been overlooked through the process. No one's fault. It's just, hey, we had to put something in. And I think now is a good opportunity for us to now go back and then figure out those criteria points so we make sure we get the right solution. And then in a lot of cases, people don't know, you can ask for a pilot of the solution, right? So let's test it in a certain space, in a certain locale, see power users, people that adopt the technology faster, get their feedback before we roll it all out to the whole enterprise.
And I think this goes without saying as well, but feedback should be both pre and post implementation, right? Rather than kind of throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks, it helps to go direct to the source of your employees and conduct intelligent surveys and research around what will be most impactful for them, right? Trends are one thing, there's plenty of surveys and data is already out there, but I always caution people about doing that just because your unique industry or your unique workforce is going to have a different perspective, and they just appreciate being asked, right? And that again helps with the change management and adoption curve if they feel like they were part of the solutioning, right? And it feels just as much like they came up with the idea as IT kind of dictating something to you from on high.
And that'll actually help with adoption, right? People actually use it if they feel a part of it. Great point, Casey.
Yeah, well said.
So again, thank you, Casey. Thank you, Idris. I'm going to just give it off to Kevin to close us out.
Yeah, so I think one last thing we should always keep in mind is we have a much more mobile workforce, mobile in the sense that they could go to other companies. And if we don't pay attention to their needs, Casey, you referenced that 30% said that that's not smart enough. If we don't pay attention to that, these companies are going to be much more willing to take off and go someplace else. And so I think one of the things we take away is that we really think about what kind of tools we have to keep our talent happy. That's going to be really critical. I want to thank CBRE. I know some of the things I said sounded like I was doing a pitch for them. I don't apologize for that. I think they do a great job, and they're certainly good supporters of the tech community. More importantly, they bring a lot of great resources to the table. So I want to give a virtual clap to the CBRE team. I am going to bring back Sarah for just a second. Sarah's going to give away a set of Padres tickets, and then we will go ahead and end this. Sarah, how do you want to do that? Do you want to go? This is on YouTube, so I don't know if you want to mention people